Okay, so I just want to welcome everybody here today for TASA Thursday. Before we begin, I just want to do a little bit of acknowledgement to country. So TASA acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of this land. TASA recognises the continuing connection to land, waters and culture and pays respect to elders past, present and emerging. You're most welcome to tell us where you're joining us from today in the chat room below. If you do have any questions throughout the session, feel free to pop them into the chat box, or when we do get to the end of the session, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to be on camera and ask Dorinda some questions yourself. So Dorinda, I'm going to hand over to you, and yeah, so we can hear more about your presentation.
Okay, thank you. It's been quite lovely to be invited to do this. I also would just like to acknowledge that I'm on Whadjuk Noongar land here in, as we also know as Perth. And also I thought I would like to, know where different nations are. So I was just like to acknowledge as well that I do also teach down in what we call Mandurah, but that is the Pinjarra people. So yeah, I'd just like to acknowledge that as well. All right, so I'm going to share my slides, which should work. There we go. I'm assuming you can all see that.
We can.
Yes, excellent, good. So yeah, the title of my presentation is Outside and Inside the Arena of Intensive Mothering. Now, I did present this at TASA last year, so in 2026, and I do also want to acknowledge that this is based on an article which I published in Sociology, and also that I won the ECR Best Paper Award for last year, and which is why Penny did also say, oh, could you please present that? So I'm like, yes, okay, great, here we are. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. I will run through it, and yeah, please put your questions in the chat, and hopefully I don't believe this presentation is terribly long, so it'd be great if we can have like a really good discussion afterwards. I'd enjoy that. The reference for the article that this is based on then is also in my last slide. So with this project, what I was particularly interested in is the decision-making process of that people went through when they were faced with an unplanned pregnancy. And why I was interested in this is because this decision is often presented as it's the pregnant person's decision only. And so they kind of like, everyone else needs to back off from that and just, leave the person alone, let her make her own decision. And so I was just really interrogating that process. Who did she consult with? What factors influenced her decision? Was it a standalone process, or was there also influence from other people, other events, other different, what were the ways of thinking that were behind this process of the decision making? I'll just go to my next slide now. There we go. So this is an overview of my presentation that I'm going to do this morning. I'll give you a brief introduction, project outline. The two theoretical concepts that I really want to outline are the intensive mothering and then the arena of othering as well. I'll share some findings with you, and then just as a bit of a discussion, and it'd be really great to get your thoughts on this as well, just the idea of resisting othering and how we can resist othering that does occur amongst women in these positions and in other ways as well. Yeah. So next slide, there we go. So yeah, the project, my short title was called Post-Abortion Narrative Project. What was really interesting about this project, I did talk to you about the decision-making process when faced with an unplanned pregnancy. What I really found with the narratives is that this entwinement between abortion discourse and motherhood discourse, and it really struck me that you could not separate the two. The women that I interviewed, they did not separate the two. They presented all of their story, their narrative as a complete whole, and really compared back to previous children that they'd had or children that they had after they'd had the abortion. And this really struck me, and that's why I really looked into the whole motherhood discourse as well, because I felt that you couldn't talk about one without the other. Yes, so I had approximately 20 participants from the greater Perth area. it was great that because my project happened during COVID, that I had actually designed it. That no, I was going to base it in Perth. I lived in Perth, etc. But because of COVID, it was great. I didn't have to travel anywhere, and so I could continue as best I could throughout COVID, which was helpful for me. So all of the women were aged between 24 and 45 at the time of interview, and they were aged 18 to 43 at the time of the abortion. So I had a diversity in age, socioeconomic area, marital status, education, occupation, and family composition. I had several participants from the UK, one from Singapore, one Australian Indigenous, and one New Zealand Indigenous, and also someone with a Burmese background. And then the other participants they identified as white Australian. So I didn't get any, refugees, immigrants, cold women, shall we say? They're culturally and linguistically diverse. Also of note is all the participants were either currently they were in no relationship or they were in a heterosexual relationship. And so just acknowledging that my findings and this presentation cannot speak to the experiences of culturally and linguistically diverse women, and also those who are not in heterosexual relationships. So the interviews lasted approximately 60 minutes. They were semi-structured. I really allowed the participant to sort of like lead the discussion. So I had topics, but it was really like what they talked about. That's what was sort of given priority. I did also do a drawing exercise with them, which was a real co-design, sort of co-creation sort of thing. And that was used to summarize the narrative of the participants, especially as it related to the decision-making process. I'm not going to go into detail here about that, but I have written about that elsewhere and published that whole process if you are interested. Data analysis I did using NVivo 12. For the first 13 interviews or so, I stayed quite close to the data, really using in vivo coding, taking codes from what they said, their words, etc. So this was 13 interviews, was a bit over halfway, and at that point, I really sort of stepped back and did a lot of reflection and going back to the literature, really sort of like thinking about like, okay, so what is it that is coming out? Like it's one thing for them to say, okay, they said this and this and this, but what exactly is that saying to us, right? And so at that point, then I really rearranged my codes and incorporated the theoretical underpinnings as well. And the final result then, sort of went back over the first three, but also continued then for the rest of the interviews. And the result was really this mix of inductive and deductive coding. Some of the codes were very much like followed a bit of a chronological sort of approach, to how they move through that decision-making process. But then, of course, there were also other codes where it was like really, very literature-based, like feminist thinking, for example. Yeah. Okay, so I do want to talk about the two theoretical frameworks, and the first one here is called intensive mothering, which you may be familiar with. This style of parenting was first described by Sharon Hays back in 1996, and I've got a quote here from her, which is really the crux of how she describes intensive mothering, and calls it child-centered, expert-guided, emotionally absorbing, labour-intensive, and financially expensive. And what I think here is really important is the child-centered notion, emotionally absorbing, labour-intensive, and financially expensive, because it really, well, we'll get more into that as well, sort of like precludes a sort of socioeconomic standing, I suppose, of people who are able to achieve this, and precludes some who cannot, and we'll talk more about that later. Prani Liamputong, she was at the University of New South Wales. She described this kind of parenting or mothering as having three goals. And you can talk about parenting, but you can also specifically talk about mothering, because it is often the mother that does this work. And having these three goals. One is caring for the child's physical and emotional needs. The second one is teaching the child appropriate cultural and social norms. and 3 is facilitating success for the child. And success here is really understood to be very broad, like success in pretty much you name it, what field you're talking about, what area you're talking about, domain, etc. And the mother is the one who has to facilitate that success. So in this paradigm, the needs of the child become all-consuming and ever-present. And it's interesting that the needs of the child are not questioned. They're just sort of accepted as fact. And the mother really can only attend to her own needs through using the happy mother, happy child paradigm. That means that she can only justify spending time on herself or taking time for herself if she can justify that that's going to make her a better mother. It will reflect in her parenting and create the circumstances needed so that the outcome will be a happy child and, going by point 3, also a successful child. So to be able to provide this kind of parenting or mothering, it generally requires the support of 2 parents, one to be the breadwinner and one to be the full-time caregiver. So as a result, this style of parenting is best suited to those who are situated in families with the support of a partner and the family is generally well resourced so they can provide for the needs of the child. So generally we see this to be middle-class families that can model intensive parenting, while those that are less resourced or single parents, for example, they find it more difficult to follow this paradigm. But what's interesting is that it does not mean that those that are less resourced are following a different paradigm in their own way of doing things, and as well that they haven't internalized this model as the gold standard. And we're going to come back to this sort of gold standard of mothering later. So because there is this pressure to facilitate success for the child, the mother is also under pressure then to provide, extracurricular activities to enrich the child, or if necessary, to provide therapy for the child, whatever the child needs to navigate childhood into successful adulthood. Those who are able to parent in this way and do parent in this way, they're positioned as a good mother. But those who cannot or do not, because it could be those that just say, no, I'm not going to do that, they're positioned as a bad mother. And they're often seen to be lazy. Often low-income mums are sort of categorised in this way. And as a result, they're also deemed irresponsible because people then talk about the outcomes for the child, meaning that they, are not going to be successful. Perhaps they're going to have trauma. Perhaps they're going to need therapy, need psychological help, etc. And, these are all drain, I suppose, on people's finances and perhaps even the state's, finances, resources, etc. So I'll go to my next slide. And this is the other theoretical framework that I used in this paper. And it's I really want to talk about the arena of othering. And this was first described by Nevo in 2002. But to understand the arena of othering, I first want to talk about what Said said about the other, and also de Beauvoir, what she said about woman as other, because both of these sort of set the backdrop for what then I present as the arena of othering. So just talking about the other in general, the process of creating the other creates boundaries between them and us, self and other, through the identification of negative difference. Most commonly, othering is drawn along lines of difference such as gender, age, ethnicity, class, etc. But the process of naming the other, by doing that, the dominant group is able to maintain boundaries and uphold the accepted social order. Interestingly, Said, he was particularly interested in othering with race and ethnicity, etc. So he added the lens of power to this concept. He argued that those in the dominant group had the power to name, identify, and describe the other, while the other lacked the authority to self-represent or contribute to the discourse. So this exclusion allows the self, which is then the dominant group, to name and exclude or silence the other. So relevant to this topic, because we're talking about abortion discourse, we're not following the general lines where you would say this is the male or the white people as opposed to others. In this particular case, it's actually like flipped a little bit, and the male is placed outside and is often excluded from discourse. And the other category which are excluded are religious others. So even though there is a growing number of people in Australia that are nominating no religion as their religion, shall we say, on the census, religious opponents are still considered powerful. They're actually quite visible often as well. And they are therefore othered similarly to men within the context of abortion decision making. And I just want to really specify that this is in this context of abortion decision making. In other contexts, this will be the other way around. But both of these groups are seen as dangerous and then are therefore excluded or silenced. And dangerous, I mean, in terms of upsetting the boundaries, upsetting the way of doing things, and particularly like you would think of, say, the rights to abortion, for example, or the way you understand the role of women, their understandings of, my body, for example. So going from that, then I just want to talk about de Beauvoir and her book, The Second Sex. So she identified woman as other, and her explanation really leans on the Western duality thinking that names categories in pairs. So you've got men and women, you've got young and old, you've got rich and poor, and so you've got this duality then, which then really positions women as other. And the opposite then, and this is placed against the monolithic figure male. And she often capitalizes male, actually, to really make it a monolithic figure. And she argues that the role of the woman is to uphold the status and privilege of the male, which obviously she was fighting against. This understanding of this setup, shall we say, has been foundational to various feminist writings. Some argue that it's essentially the refusal of these hierarchies that between men and women, that structure the history of feminist thought. This rejection of the construction of women as inferior that bind all women together in a common experience, while men then are portrayed as the enemy, and this comes from bell hooks, creating a clear boundary between self and the dangerous other. And this is why I guess we could use the term dangerous other. And because it's really so stark, that is also why men, and as I said before, the religious other, are placed outside, and it's quite a hard boundary. So I find this lens of othering useful, but why I didn't fully adopt it was because it's generally analysed uni-directionally. So generally it's used to examine the practice of othering by the dominant group to the marginalised group. So from men towards women, or from white groups to not white groups, etc. And that's young versus old, etc. Right? But the problem with this, in the context of this project, was that it obscures the othering that can occur within the marginalised group. And this is where I found that the concept of the arena of othering to be really helpful, because it allows an examination of the othering that occurs within the marginalised group. So in this project that I did, all the participants, including myself as a researcher, we've already been placed as other in comparison to the male, right? So all of the women, all of the participants identified as women, myself as a woman, we've already been placed vis-a-vis the male, right? So you've already then been placed as a separate group. And so while yet male and religious others, they're placed outside the arena and generally excluded from talking about this particular topic. I'm focusing on the othering then that occurs within this arena and amongst the women themselves. And I argue that the function of this othering is actually different. It's not about boundary markers in the same way as excluding the male, the dangerous other, and labeling them as such, but it's actually more about maintaining the image of the responsible self. So it's a way of saying that, I'm, in this case, I'm a good mother as opposed to a bad mother. And we're going to see how that functions later, further in this presentation. So I've got in the next 3 slides, actually, I'm presenting quotes from participants that fall into certain categories of mothers or women. And all 3 of the categories really sort of present a type of woman, type of mother who the participants felt probably should not mother, right? They would be, I was talking about the boundary line between the good and the bad mother, or the responsible and the irresponsible mother, right? So these are really presented as those who shouldn't really mother, probably because they would not be able to reach that gold standard that we talked about previously, the intensive mothering paradigm. They might not have the resources to really provide and invest in their children as would be expected. So the first category, I talk about the poor mother, the poor woman, sorry, and poor being here resource poor. And they were that the participants that I have here on the slide, they felt that they could name and identify these as those who probably shouldn't parent. So we have here first Liz, and she said this, when I see mums who look obviously jobless, alcoholics, smoke, pushing a pram and smoking, then you just feel, why even bother popping? And then Louise also said, the fact that you can be as poor as you can be on, bones of your ass poor sort of thing, and not be able to provide for a kid, and yet because you're lucky enough to be able to fall pregnant naturally, you get to have this child. So she was really promoting the idea that you should be assessing your circumstances, and if you can't provide all that you believe should be necessary for the child, then you shouldn't continue with that pregnancy. I find these quite stark, and in some ways, sometimes when I present this, people are actually a little bit shocked that people actually say this. And what was really interesting is that they did not self-correct either. They just said this as if this was perfectly obvious and acceptable way of thinking about other women and other mothers in particular. As a counter narrative, and I don't have a quote here from this participant on this slide, her name was Rachel. She resisted this stigma that came with single parenting. She lived in a lower socioeconomic area. She had not finished a university education, and she was precariously employed. So she objected to the notion that you would date someone just to get at their money, which is what she was sort of like feeling when she would date a new person, and then people would be going, oh, be careful, she's just up there to get your money. And she really objected to that. And she said, it's really frustrating. I run my own household, been doing it for years. Why would I need anything? She also performed, yes, so just to pause this, so she really rejected that notion and was like, I can provide for these children. What's also interesting of note is she also really performed good mothering activities, right? So she would make sure that she was available for her children outside of school. She would perform tasks like doing hospital bed sits, school runs, and because she still then performed those activities, she felt that then she could point to some mothers that she felt also still deserve judgment because they didn't do that, right? Because she does know women that don't work, they didn't walk their kids to school. And sort of like she was like, well, come on, surely you can just do a little bit, but performing certain activities such as the hospital bed sits, etc., being available for school, she was able to still uphold the image of the responsible good mother, and in that way she could protect her own self-image. But the problem with this is that it doesn't interrogate or dislodge that gold standard of good mothering, the intensive mothering that we saw earlier. So the next category is the young teenage woman. These women or young people are often seen to be irresponsible and deemed not to be able to be adequately provide for their child or children. There's this sort of social concern and think around the media, government policies, etc. And they're often centered around the fear that these women will need to be supported by the government indefinitely and not be able to contribute to society as you would want or expect an adult to do. Media studies have also shown a persistent link between young teenage mothers and then problematic parenting. And examples of that would be unsupervised kids after school. So this, again, this sort of narrative, this discourse, the comments, media commentary, etc., it sort of implicitly upholds the gold standard of mothering, the need to be available for your children, the need to be able to provide for all of their needs, the expectation to do extracurricular activities after school for their enrichment, etc., etc. Right, and you can probably think of your own examples there. So we have a quote here from Leanne. She was actually 18 at the time of her abortion, just 18, I think. She really, really hated the experience and decided that she was never going to do that again. So when she became pregnant again, she was still 18. She felt that she had no choice but to continue the pregnancy. What she found is that, and she really objected to this, the way she objected to the way young teenage mothers are portrayed in the media, as we noted above. She used to watch Teen Mums at the time, and just really, she was kind of like, I don't know why I watch it, because really commented on all the drama that just continued to happen every episode. She said the kids always look feral, and this depiction of the teen mums as irresponsible and not really being able to do their job properly is what she really objected to. And as you can see from the quote here as well, she says people just assume that teenagers can't raise babies and be decent people, which is not true. She also objected to the treatment that she felt that she received in the hospital, and she compared it to when she went in for her second child, and she was actually married at that time. And she felt that the treatment that she received was very different. When she was the single mum, she was kind of babied. And then when she was married, she was just treated as a responsible woman, and was really very different. So in both of these categories, the poor woman from the previous slide and now the young woman, these women are deemed unsuitable for parenting because of their age or class, assuming that they are not able to provide for every emotional, physical need of the child. It's assumed that they lack the resources to set up their child for success, as a more resourced parent is able to do. And again, we see here the sort of like the expectation of the gold standard of good mothering, intensive mothering. And then when these women are not able to provide, it's considered best for the child and a more responsible decision to terminate the pregnancy. So the third category that I have here is what I've called the foolish woman, and that's not their word, that's sort of like the way they sort of talked about it. And the foolish woman is one who's considered uneducated, especially with regards to reproductive health and contraceptive use. And a common theme in these in interviews when this was a case was sort of like, I should have known better, or I should have been more responsible. And so we have the quote here. I think the fact that I'd allowed it to happen and I hadn't been, and she took a big pause here, breathing quite heavily, because I'd seen myself as being smart. I was an educated person, I'd done well in high school, I'd gone to uni. The fact that it had happened was because I had, as I saw at the time, low self-esteem. And then I was ashamed that I'd got myself into that situation. And it was really about, getting pregnant in the first place, not being responsible with regard to contraceptive use. And what's interesting about this quote is that in this category, the other comes very close to the self. So unlike Rachel and Leanne, who could really push back on the dominant narratives of the poor woman or the teenage woman and really go, that's the way it's depicted. I'm not that because I do this and this and this. In this case, becoming accidentally pregnant meant that there was no real buffer between self and other. So if you think back to like the role of this othering that's happening within this arena is to bolster the image of the responsible self, this became harder to maintain when faced with an unplanned pregnancy. And it actually caused significant discomfort for the participant when they were talking about it. So as the topic of abortion is a very polarised discourse, it's not surprising that the participants operationalise the first category of the other to signal who may and who may not contribute to the discussion. So in her discussion on racism, Farida Fosda, she's at Curtin University now, has used the term dueling discourses, where antagonistic discourses coexist and are necessary to legitimate each other. Similarly, in the discourse of reproductive health, boundary watching does occur, right? Naming and excluding some participants from participating in the discourse. It does occur. However, when you then sort of like don't think about the boundaries on the outside, shall we say, towards the male, for example, but you actually look within the arena of othering, those that engage in the othering processes here, they try to disidentify from those women or mothers that they deem, or I guess more largely as society, we deem not suitable for ideal mothering. So really referencing the gold standard of intensive mothering, participants indicate that they've internalized this ideal for mothering, and then they invoke it to bolster the self-image of the good mother. The problem with this is that this practice of othering makes the expectation of intensive mothering invisible, and as a result, not available for interrogation. And at the same time, it continues to shape the decision-making process when faced with an unplanned pregnancy. So what I propose here is that rather than inadvertently reproducing this expectation of intensive mothering, I've taken this good enough paradigm, which actually Louise, one of the participants that we saw earlier, she also referenced. And I find that maybe this is a way that we can then resist this othering that is occurring and be more embracing, I suppose, of different ways of thinking about mothering. So just to explain a little bit more about the good enough paradigm. So when faced with her first pregnancy, which she terminated, Louise experienced a lot of anxiety around whether she would bond with her child, whether she'd be able to provide with a child, whether she'd, accidentally traumatize a child or forget about a child or whatever it might be. Lots of things that she was really worried about. But then when it's quite soon after she terminated, because she'd done a lot of thinking and processing about mothering, etc., she then became intentionally pregnant. But it didn't mean that those fears had, magically gone away. But she was still afraid that, she'd accidentally do something wrong. She'd create trauma, which, the child would then have to go through therapy to undo. But at the same time, she has chosen not to just be like her friends. She talks about her friends and the way they talk about their children. When how mothers get together and often talk about their children. And she noted that her friends would talk about they'd be sort of like anxiously looking at their children and thinking, is there any special talent that they have which then I need to nurture? They'd be rushing from extracurricular activity to another extracurricular activity. They'd be going from private school to private school, really going, oh, now this school wasn't good enough, and looking for the next school and really trying to get the best education for the child. And she decided that she was just not going to be that way. So, for instance, with the private schools, she went, no, I'm not going to spend all that money on this particular private school. I'm going to go to the public school, which is in my area. It's a good school, and it's useful for me. It's nice and close, etc. We can walk there. And she went, no, good enough is enough. And that's what I have here on the slide. Good enough is good enough. And I thought this was very interesting because she didn't reference Winnicott, but this actually does come from Winnicott. Back in 1953, he promoted the sort of good enough paradigm, the good enough parenting, he called it, and really emphasized that this doesn't mean that this kind of parenting is less than perfect, but it does mean that the mother, in this particular case, we're talking about intensive mothering, etc., that they actually refrain from trying to give everything and trying to, provide everything. Because the problem with that is that that requirement actually includes giving all of themselves, which is not really sustainable. And even if you think of the outcomes, even the perfect mum is not able to completely provide for every need or protect the child from every single threat. But the problem with intensive parenting and intensive mothering is that the mother still maintains the burden of responsibility for every outcome, even though it's not attainable. And I think that if we think more about good enough parenting, as Louise sort of like used to resist othering and to resist this requirement of intensive parenting, and I think that if then also as more broadly we focus on good enough parenting, this then shifts the focus from the quality and the qualifications of the mother, and it shifts that focus to the support systems that are around the mother and the child. Good enough mothering provides the opportunity to embrace support from the father. You can look at, like, say, the workplace and think about a good enough workplace, a good enough community, a good enough community programs, etc. And are these all these things which surround the mother and the child? What are they doing to address the needs of the child? Well, the needs of the mother and the child. And I think that this provides a way to resist the othering that occurs not just towards the monolithic male figure, but also between women who are then already placed in the arena of mothering. And I think that it shifts the gaze away from the perceived ability of the woman to mother appropriately, according to that gold standard of intensive mothering. And it removes the lines between good and bad mother, responsible and irresponsible mother. And what I really think is great about this, and also I think is necessary, is that then we can shift our focus from the mother and what she is or not doing, and it allows us to focus on the systems that are needed to be there so that both mother and child can flourish. That was my last slide. This is my references, and I just want to say thank you.